Welcome to this podcast interview for the Los Angeles Review of Books. My name is Arne De Boever. I am the Critical Theory Philosophy Section Editor for the Review. I'm here today with Professor Judith Butler. She's Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. Judith, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're in LA to give four public lectures. They're assembled under the title, let me make sure I get this right, Demonstrating Precarity, Vulnerability, Embodiment, and Resistance. Readers of your work, I think, will hear an echo here of the title of one of your recent books, Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence. Could you talk maybe a little bit about how you arrived from Precarious Life at the topic of these public lectures?
Mm-hmm. Well, my public lectures tend to be concerned with the idea of public assembly, and what it means when bodies come together to protest or to assert certain kinds of demands or to object to certain social conditions. And in the last years, I've been particularly interested in demonstrations against precarity, or sometimes in the European context, demonstrations against austerity. They're obviously referencing fiscal policies that produce rather stark economic consequences for a vast number of people. In general, the right of public assembly, which has been with us for some time, and I think was originally posited as a right on the part of laborers to assemble and decide whether or not they wanted to be part of a union, or to assemble to decide and negotiate their wages. That right of assembly has often been understood as an abstract right without thinking about the fact that it requires bodies to come together, and it's a right that is a right that presupposes mobility, the freedom to gather, and the freedom to speak. Rights of assembly strike me as different from rights of association or indeed rights of free expression. They fundamentally involve the body in a collective, embodied set of acts.
Your first lecture, which was titled From Performativity to Precarity, it reached even farther back, I think, into your oeuvre. You went all the way back there to your classic text, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. How did a theorist of gender end up writing about public assemblies?
Well, I think back in 1988-89, when I was writing Gender Trouble, I was certainly interested in social movements, and I was watching gay lesbian movement emerge in certain forms and take particular shape in relationship to what was then understood as an HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States and in some other places as well, the UK, France, and yet the theory of gender performativity that emerged in a way in the course of those reflections was very often understood to be a theory that focused on individual acts, or individual acts by which you perform a gender or take on a gender. Mm-hmm. And some people thought it was a highly volitional view, that is to say that we're utterly free to take on whatever gender we want, and also that it was an individualistic view, so you're free to take on your gender and I'm free to take on mine, and that's part of our individual liberty. Mm-hmm. So that was a little distressing that there was that was one way of reading the text. I understood why people might read it that way, but I was nevertheless somewhat distressed. So in the years that followed, I tried to return to the theory of performativity in order to show its social and political dimensions more carefully. It's true that performativity, broadly understood, is a comes from a theory of language that talks about how language makes things happen, how certain categories can bring social realities into being, or produce certain kinds of effects. It's a theory that in some ways underscores the powerful effects of discourse. But there's a question: how is it that we embody discourses, especially the discourses of gender, and what can we do? What kind of agency do we have in relationship to the categories that inhabit us and that we in turn inhabit? So for me, thinking about what happens when we act in common, what happens when we act in concert, Hannah Arendt's views have been important for me as I try to think about what performative action looks like when people undertake that in common, and demonstrations are, of course, a key way in which that happens. Mm-hmm. When people are demonstrating about precarity, for instance, it's not just that they get up and say we're against precarity. They are also embodied creatures in public space who are calling attention to the embodied character of their lives. That this is a body that doesn't have shelter, or this is a body that deserves shelter. This is a body that ought not to be hungry. This is a body that ought to have some sense of future about its work or its possibilities for flourishing. In other words, the body is not just the vehicle for the expression of a political view, but it's the common corporeal predicament of those who need to be supported by proper infrastructure and proper social services and proper economic conditions and prospects. So that struck me as another way of making this point, and one that I guess for obvious reasons is important to me as it is to, I think, many other people at this point.
You seem to thereby reverse a move that is made in Michel Foucault's work, where he says at some point in the history of sexuality, he has this famous call for us to cut off the head of the king, and instead, for us in our analysis of power, look elsewhere. It was by political issues, the field of sexuality and race, and it seems like gender trouble very much came from there to a certain extent, even though you were also very critical of his reading of Hercule Barbin and so on and so forth. But then now the concern with sovereignty seems to be coming back in your work. Is that a fair characterization? Was Foucault too quick in calling on us to abandon sovereignty as a...
No, I think Foucault was perfectly right, but I think I'm probably meaning something very different from the concept of sovereignty that he had in mind. I mean, the sovereignty of the king is, of course, the sovereignty of the unified figure, the human figure that stands for state power and that is state power. And of course, it's possible to model state sovereignty on the implicit or explicit figure of the king. But when you talk about popular sovereignty, it seems very different. The people is not we can't say that the people who exercise popular sovereignty are a unified subject. In my view, they are not a unified subject. There's no way they're unified. They're a discordant and cacophonous set of voices and demands that nevertheless can coalesce in the exercise of popular sovereignty. So one question is whether the idea of sovereignty, even in popular sovereignty, is so wedded to the idea of a unified master subject like the king that we can't use it. It's too contaminated by that history. But what if we think about distributed sovereignty? What if we think about shared sovereignty? What do we think about divisible sovereignty? It can simply be a way of naming that complex situation in which rights of political self-determination are exercised without there being a presumption of a unified subject who's exercising them.
And that kind of sovereignty of the people is preferable to notions of the multitude, for example, or these debates?
Well, I think, I mean, surely the idea of the multitude is an important one, and if one goes back to look at Spinoza's work on the theological and the political, one finds a really interesting set of formulations, and many people have, including that word, multitude, many people have thought about it including obviously Tony Negri and Michael Hart, but also Etienne Balibar and others, and in some ways that are, I think, a little bit distinct from the Hart-Negri view. The multitude, I think, is a way of naming the complex, affective, political movement of people who are not a unified crowd and who are not a unified subject. But I'm not sure that it leads us to the kinds of democratic and parliamentary outcomes that I'm also interested in. In other words, I don't necessarily want to understand assembled action or even the popular will as something that has nothing to do with representative democracy or parliamentary changes of a significant kind. For me, there's a kind of blurring between those lines. I don't think, I do think that if we could talk about the will of the people, I don't think it's ever fully represented by a particular parliamentary or state structure. At the same time, I don't think we can have a way of thinking about the legitimacy of state structure without there being some recourse to the popular will, which is necessarily outside of it. So those are complex interrelationships, and I want to be able to think about those. I'm not sure the multitude lets me do that.
Right, and so the will of the people is never fully exhausted by the representative structures that claim to voice it or concern themselves with it, or?
I think that's a kind of necessity that democratic theorists generally acknowledge, that even when the people vote and put someone in office, or they accept a rule or a law or even found a state, the minute they actually start instituting their will, the will becomes less complex and it vanishes to some degree. There's always an abbreviation of the will in the effect of the will. That seems right, but the idea that there could be a withdrawal of the will of the people from rules, from laws, even from an entire state apparatus, remains a really important one, and I don't want us to give up that notion that people do have the power to withdraw their consent, and that can have fairly powerful consequences.
Yes, and that seems to be, I don't know if this is the correct way to put it, but a kind of negative way, withdrawal to build a grouping, a community, a people. I don't know if you'll remember this, but after your second talk, we had a conversation with the audience in which someone was bringing up the Je suis Charlie campaign that's been going on, and we didn't really talk about this then, but it seems to me that there's a problem that comes up there with the positive identification with Charlie, whereas one might want to withdraw from the terroristic act that was committed there. That doesn't necessarily, can't necessarily be equated with a positive identification with Charlie, which might be offensive or problematic for many believers. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, it's always curious to me why people think that identification or asserting identification is the way to show solidarity. It could be that when someone says Je suis Charlie, that they mean it could have been me, or I stand with him, or they could simply be saying I think what happened to those who worked for the Charlie Hebdo, the assassinations, is absolutely wrong, and I wish to make my views known. And that's really a condemnation of what happened. It's a condemnation of those assassinations. I'm not sure that the language of identification is always the best way to do that, because I gather if one's going to be consistent, one would be against the assassination of any group of people who are working in a political venue or who are engaged in the formulation of political or satirical work. In other words, why Well, I mean, it's important to mark that those assassinations were wrong, but one needs to also say, maybe in the same breath, that all kinds of assassinations are wrong. In other words, to generalize the claim. Otherwise, it seems like a very particularistic term. Like, I'm only against the assassination of people who worked at Charlie Hebdo. No, I mean, no one wants to say that, right? We appeal to general principles, the rights to be protected from assassination, the moral condemnation of assassination. And then the question is, how expansive are our principles? Do they include all kinds of groups? Would they also include Arabs working in France who are putting out publications, some of whose views are not particularly welcome? Is assassination the correct political response to views you disagree with? No. So, trying to kind of generalize the claim seems very, very important. Otherwise, it seems like one's making a cultural identification of a certain kind and suggesting that those people who belong to that identifiable cultural affiliation ought not to be assassinated. But really, no one should be assassinated.
A lot of this resonates too with what you've said in the New York Times interview that's been doing the rounds around all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
We must, in a way, universalize the claim against all assassinations. But then when we're talking about all lives matter, obviously it seems to be important to bring out that, not all lives seem to matter, or Black lives seem to be treated differently.
Yes,
so
but there's still, I would say, an aspiration toward the universal in that piece. In other words, Black lives tend not to matter when police who kill unarmed Black men are exonerated. Black lives should matter. They should matter as much as any other life matters. Actually, all lives should matter equally. We should be radical egalitarians when it comes to the question of whose lives matter. And yet we fail in that egalitarian project. We fail to universalize that claim time and again because we have very specific cultural ideas of what a valuable life is. So if we say that only certain kinds of lives can be publicly grieved, or the assassination of certain kinds of lives should be publicly condemned, but other lives can remain unremarked, or perhaps the loss of those lives are not so important, or maybe they deserved it anyway, whatever that moral confusion is that pervades responses such as those, they suggest that we actually do have cultural prejudices. We have cultural presuppositions about what a valuable life might be and what a grievable life might be. So in the same way that I'm saying in the French context, let's make sure in saying je suis Charlie that we're not saying, those of us who come through the tradition of French republicanism hang together and we deserve not to be assassinated for furthering the views of Voltaire or the tradition of Voltaire. I mean, of course that's right, but it's also right that those lives from that tradition should matter equally to any other set of lives, including lives that don't come through that tradition. So one needs to kind of be attentive, I think, to the cultural prejudices that inform our ideas of which lives finally matter.
Right, and so I think some of this reflection happens in your work, or at least in the public lectures around this notion, we the people. But I've also seen that happen in your work around the notion of the human. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about a notion that you mentioned in Frames of War. I think it's in the chapter titled Torture and the Ethics of Photography, where you talk at some point about the human as, or you propose we think about the human as a differential norm. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that notion?
Well, first let me say this. I mean, I don't know, I picked up a journal, and there was an article on Butler's New Humanism, and I thought, oh, that's very funny. I guess it was bound to happen. And let's see, why is that the case? And then I thought, oh, it's because I'm willing to talk about the human as a category, and we're supposed to be post-human, or we're supposed to have, transcended
and
the human.
And as a norm even, right? I mean,
right.
A differential norm, but still.
Well, I think, in fact, there's no way to talk about the human outside of a field of power. I suppose I'm still a proper Foucauldian in certain ways. Whenever we're talking about the human, it seems we have to ask which version of the human is at stake, or how is it being circumscribed, and through what exclusions and with what consequences. I don't believe we can dig deep and find the ontological version of the human that is absolutely true for all humans. That's not my aspiration. It's not even my expectation. But I accept that the category of the human is a very powerful norm, and it influences so much public debate and public policy and theoretical reflection that I don't think we can do without it. Indeed, sometimes I worry that those who treat it as a kind of contaminated by humanism, we're too cool, we're too post-structuralist, we can't talk about it. They don't see that categories like this can be revisited. We can ask about their genealogy, we can ask how they've been formulated and through what occlusions and with what effects. It seems like that's a critical approach to the category of the human. I think a lot of that is happening now too in animal studies, or in technology studies. Where's the human in relationship to the animal and technology? Can we differentiate? Perhaps the human is a set of relations among these various terms. Human life and living process. How do we think about human life in terms of living processes more generally? I mean, in each of these cases, the human is not a self-sustaining category for sure. It's sustained through its embeddedness in a whole set of relationships. But that gives us something to think about, and that strikes me as very important. And yet there are ideas of the human that insist upon its isolation, its normativity, its ideal status, and there again, I'm concerned about which version of the human gets elevated to the status of the human as such, and can we think more critically in genealogy in order to uncover those kinds of biases?
Right, that seems to be an important component also of your work on Israel-Palestine.
Well, I think probably do you mean to say that the category of the human figures in my work on Israel-Palestine?
Yes, who is considered human, who falls within that count, who is left outside of it, and then, what ethical and political consequences come with that.
Well, I think one thing we find in war, and I think we can find this in several scenarios of war, is that especially those that are engaged by first world countries or in the name of Western civilization or European values, that very often the fate of the human seems to be at stake in the war. The enemies are not exactly humans. They are the threat to the human, and the human that's being defended is very often a very culturally specific idea, informed by ideas of manhood, informed by ideas of reason, informed by ideas of autonomy, of civilizational norms, of cultural and educational formation. And so in those cases, it's very hard to talk about human rights or even crimes against humanity when those who have, in fact, inflicted those crimes don't understand the beings they have destroyed, the beings they have maimed, or the beings they have displaced as within the community of the human. So, I think that's a way in which civilizational politics plays out in war scenarios.
I think it's in your last lecture that you will talk a little bit about nonviolence also. I wanted to ask you about this in part because I remember years ago taking a seminar with you on Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence at Cornell. I think it was in the School of Criticism and Theory. And wondering now, so many years later, does your thinking about nonviolence still come out of that Benjamin essay and the work you've been doing on that? How might it have changed over time? What do you mean by nonviolence at this point exactly? And when it comes to acts of resistance demonstrating in the streets, and do you come down on the side of violence or nonviolent?
It's of course interesting that I'm actually teaching Benjamin's Critique of Violence again this semester at UC Berkeley, so I guess I keep returning to that.
I think it was almost 10 years ago.
Yes, no, I keep returning. And every time I read it, I get something new. I myself defend a principled account of nonviolence. I do, and it's not easy to do, especially in light of the kinds of challenges people present to me. But I think the world would be a poorer world if no one were defending nonviolence. So it's not for that reason alone that I defend nonviolence, but I do think that it's important to think about what the justifications for violence are and what kinds of contradictions they entail. So I think I have a longer argument about nonviolence, but I'm very much in favor of nonviolence. What interests me in part, and there are many things to say here, but what interests me in part is how nonviolent action is sometimes called violent. And even Benjamin in that essay, sometimes he seems to be naming what is violent and what is nonviolent, but then if you look a bit closer, you see that he's claiming that within the perspective of a particular legal regime, any challenge to the legal regime is called violent. And what's being opposed in naming a resistance to the legal regime as a violent one is the loss of the monopoly of violence, the monopoly on violence that the state has. But in fact, many nonviolent resistance movements are called violent, not because they use force or even have violent aims, but because their effects, their delegitimating effects, are understood to be destructive in some more amorphous sense. But also, I think protocols of nonviolence on U.S. campuses are no longer being recognized or honored by police, and the police are very often trained in military methods and not so much in nonviolent civil disobedience protocols. So several years ago now at Berkeley, I guess about 5 years ago, we saw people who were offering their hands to be handcuffed in a very well-known gesture of nonviolent civil disobedience, who were thrown to the ground at that moment. People going limp and offering themselves to be taken away or arrested, who were nevertheless beaten in their limp state. And so there's a kind of general question: what has happened such that police practices such as those no longer give credence to nonviolent civil disobedience? Now, the police in those instances can say, well, those people were violent or they were a threat to security. When we talk about threat to security, again, we're in an amorphous kind of zone where, yes, a protest on a university campus, say, in opposition to tuition hikes or in opposition to increased privatization, especially if you're at a public university, that might get large enough to cause a problem for security, but it's not as if it's necessarily a violent one. Now, some people enter into protests with violent aims and do, I think, derail some of their most important directions by engaging in violence. But I must say, I don't think that's helpful or useful. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I don't know which direction you want to go in.
Well, I was actually thinking of wrapping it up. You've been very generous, generous with your time. I did wonder, just for the viewers, the listeners, will the LA lectures be collected in a book?
These lectures are, for the most part, coming out in a book called Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, to be published by Harvard University Press later this year. But the work on nonviolence will appear separately. I'm not quite sure where.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.